The FDA Advisory Committee is planning to vote on whether or not booster shots are needed for vaccinated Americans. The panel is set to decide whether or not a third dose of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine is safe and effective. However, there are growing concerns over whether it is necessary for all fully vaccinated Americans. The high-stakes meeting comes less than a week ahead of the Biden administration's plan to begin rolling out a third dose of the vaccine to people 16 and older. CBS News' Natalie Brand is at the White House with more.
The FDA's advisory committee is debating whether to approve a third booster shot for the Pfizer vaccine.
Findings of effectiveness of the additional dose, while necessary, is not sufficient for an FDA approval. A determination that the additional dose is safe for the intended use is also required.
Dr. Marian Gruber, who announced her retirement this week, co-authored a paper questioning the need for boosters for the general population. Supporters point to Israel, which is already deploying the booster shots. Data from that country showed the shot increased protection against severe illness nearly 20-fold in people 60 and older.
If we had not started booster doses at the end of July, we would have come to the capacity of Israel hospitalization capabilities and probably have gone beyond it.
FDA reviewers warned against relying on studies from other countries because the agency hadn't independently verified the data or their conclusions. While there is debate among scientists, the Biden administration has begun preparations to roll out booster shots as early as next week, pending approval.
The infrastructure that helped deliver more than 200 million first shots will be ready to go to deliver millions of booster shots as well.
Some question whether the booster shot is needed to combat the Delta variant spike. Studies show the rise in cases is most prevalent among those who remain unvaccinated.
Regardless of the vaccines evaluated, all vaccines have remained effective in preventing hospitalization and severe disease.
The latest CDC data shows roughly 63% of Americans 12 and older are fully vaccinated. Natalie Brand, CBS News, the White House.
CBS News researcher Max Bayer has been following the hearing, and he joins us now for more on this. Hi, Max. Great to see you. So the FDA panel is expected to vote on Pfizer's booster shot this afternoon. If it passes, what happens next?
If it passes, then it will go to the CDC's advisory committee. Well, I should say then the FDA would actually formally decide whether or not to approve that booster shot. Right now, the advisory committee is meeting in just that, an advisory role. If the FDA then follows that recommendation and they approve it, it will then go to CDC's advisory committee, which meets next week, which will actually make a clinical recommendation on who should get these shots. Then the CDC director would sign off on those recommendations next week.
And if the booster shot is not approved, Max, what does it mean for the Biden administration's target date of September 20th to begin rolling out vaccine boosters nationwide?
Well, that date would mean nothing. The boosters would not be rolling out on that date. I guess more politically, the boosters not being approved would obviously be something that the Biden administration has to double back on. They were the first to announce this plan. For them to not be approved would be, of course, kind of questioning that initial science and that initial announcement, and that would be something that they'd have to grapple with.
So the FDA's most recent findings, Max, state that vaccines distributed in the U.S. provide sufficient protection against severe COVID-19 infections. But in the meantime, we're seeing reports out of Israel, of course, about the waning efficacy of the Pfizer vaccine and touting the success of a third booster shot, especially in preventing the Delta variant from infecting large groups of people. So could we see a partial approval for a booster shot in some more high-risk Americans rather than the general population as a whole?
That is definitely under consideration. When the CDC's advisors last met tentatively, that was something that they had on the table, which would be making a booster dose available to people 65 or older or healthcare workers. So exactly as you mentioned, kind of those higher risk groups. I think the interesting thing about Israel that was being touted heading into this meeting was that they also had some signs that there may be waning immunity against severe disease in some of those younger populations, people younger than 60. That data was a little bit more complicated and kind of convoluted. But what they noted in the meeting today is that health administrators there felt that they needed to administer booster doses in younger populations to actually reduce the spread of the virus. So that's something that I think that people also might be taking into account, is not just whether or not you need to give a booster to reduce the risk of severe illness, but whether you need to reduce the risk of vaccinated people from spreading it. That will be something interesting to see whether FDA advisors discuss that further today.
Absolutely, because that exact point is something that has worried health officials here in the U.S., sort of the finding that vaccinated Americans who do get infected are equally as successful in passing on the COVID vaccine as unvaccinated Americans. And I think once that was clear, that certainly put the future into a different into a different box. Max, I want to ask you about vaccine hesitancy, because it is, of course, still a huge issue across the country. The FDA is now discussing a third COVID-19 vaccine injection, but millions of Americans still haven't gotten their first. So, we're focusing on this booster, but shouldn't we really be focusing on the fact that not enough Americans have even gotten their first shot, that so many people remain completely unvaccinated?
That's a terrific point. And that's something that health experts and some health officials are thinking about as we look at boosters, is even if we decide to administer some sort of policy like this, the forefront, what we should be really thinking about is how to get that first dose to people who are unvaccinated. We are seeing record low levels of vaccine hesitancy in people who are unvaccinated. So I think that's why this is a bit of a make or break moment. You, want to make sure that the communication on boosters, if that is policy that's approved, is clear so that people who are fully vaccinated know what to do. But you also don't want there to be miscommunication there so that unvaccinated people start to see a rise in hesitancy. I think the Biden administration and health officials are thinking about capitalizing on an increase in vaccine mandates, a decrease in vaccine hesitancy, to make sure that they are still maximizing the first doses that they can administer. And it's very important that this booster communication and that policy doesn't basically take away some of the gains that have been made there in the last couple of months.
Absolutely. Well, Max Baer, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate you sharing your insight with us.
Thank you for having me.